Okay, today's daf is Masekhet, number 69. We're going to start at the bottom of Masekhet Amud Bet, which is where we left off yesterday, because we're going to try to understand the reasoning of Munbaz. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines up from the bottom of Masekhet Amud Bet, where we are going to try to understand what is Munbaz thinking. And remember, Munbaz had a machloket, he had an argument with Rabbi Akiva, where Munbaz says that if a person were to never know about Shabbat in their entire life, so when they discover Shabbat, they don't have to bring any kind of kapara, they don't have to bring any korban, because it's not considered accidental inadvertence. They simply completely lacked any knowledge of Shabbat. And Rabbi Akiva was opposing that position, where the Tanakama actually of that Tosefta, which we presume to be Rabbi Akiva, was saying that if a person never knew about Shabbat and then they discover Shabbat, so they're liable for one korban, one sacrifice, to atone for all the violations of Shabbat, all of which emerged from the same lack of awareness. So whereas Munbaz says you need to have known at some point for us to call it a lack of awareness, according to Rabbi Akiva, lack of awareness, no matter what the cause, is treated the same. So then they had a little conversation where Rabbi Akiva said, where are you getting the idea that a person who does something inadvertently has to have some level of awareness? And Munbaz says, because I learn it by making an equation between somebody who does something on purpose. The Torah equates somebody who does something on purpose to somebody who does it by accident. And I say what that means is that the person who does something by accident also has to have a level of awareness. So Rabbi Akiva asked him, well, according to that, what's the difference between accident and on purpose? If in both cases they know what they're doing, so what's the difference? Okay, and that's what we were up to. So now the Gemara asks, Mai ta'amad de Munbaz? What is the reasoning of Munbaz? Dichtiv, as it says in the pasuk, Torah achat yelachem la'oseh b'shgaga, because it says there should be one procedure for you, for somebody who does something inadvertently. And immediately after it says the person who does the action on purpose. In other words, right after mentioning the atonement that is brought for doing something by accident, it mentions the individual who commits the sin with a high hand, meaning to say he does it purposefully, intentionally. So there's a comparison here. Hikish shogeg lemezid. This is comparing on purpose to by accident. How so? Ma mezid shaita lo yediah. Just like a person who does something intentional knows what they're doing. Af shogeg shaita lo yediah. Similarly, the person who does something inadvertently had awareness of what he was doing. Now we're going to see that Munbaz extends that concept pretty far, but we're not up to that yet. But the point is that this is a refutation or a response to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva being the one who said that he didn't have to have any prior awareness in his life. Munbaz is saying he has to have had prior awareness, at least in his life, of the concept of Shabbat in order to be liable. Because shogeg inadvertent presupposes some level of awareness. What do the rabbis do with this juxtaposition of the pasuk? They needed for a different limud, a different teaching, which Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi taught his son. Torah achat yelachem la'oseh b'shgaga, because it says Torah achat yelachem la'oseh b'shgaga, that there's one procedure for anybody who commits a sin inadvertently. Uchtiv, and then it says in another pasuk right nearby, v'chi tishgu v'lo ta'asu et kol ha'mitzvot ha'eleh. When you make an error and you commit all of these and you violate all of the mitzvot, which the rabbis interpret in Masekhet Torayot to mean you commit the sin of idolatry. Violating all the mitzvot means you violated the one commandment that is equal to all of them. Uchtiv, and then it says, the person who does it on purpose. Okay, in other words, these three pesukim are all in the same vicinity. One talks about bringing a sacrifice for inadvertent violation. The other one talks about bringing a sacrifice for idolatry. And then it mentions committing the sin on purpose. So we see that idolatry is equated to all of these cases. Ma le'alan davar shechayavim al zidono karet v'shigigato chatat. Av kol davar shechayavim al zidono karet ve'al shigigato chatat. In other words, what do we learn from the juxtaposition of the intentional violator and the inadvertent violator? We don't learn that the inadvertent violator needs to have had previous awareness. What we learn is the type of violation for which a korban is brought. Not the type of person who brings that kind of korban, but the type of violation for which it is brought. Namely, a violation which would be karet, which would be excision from the Jewish people or loss of olam haba if the person committed it on purpose. So in other words, it's telling you the category of people who bring, or the category of sins that necessitate a korban chatat, which the principle is anything shezidono karet, anything which, if done on purpose, would bring a person the penalty of karet, the penalty of excision, which either can be interpreted physically that the person is going to die or not have children, or it means it spiritually that they're going to lose olam haba, depending which interpretation you take. Karet is karet, it means being cut off. Anything which, if done purposefully, would bring you karet, if done accidentally, requires a korban chatat. That's what it's teaching you. Not that just like an intentional violator has prior awareness or awareness at the moment, so too must the inadvertent violator have had some kind of awareness. That's not what it's teaching you. It's teaching you the type of sin. And what is the type of sin? It's modeled after the sin of idolatry. Just like idolatry is a sin that would give you karet if you did it on purpose, it's a sin that will bring you to obligate you in a korban chatat, a sin offering if done inadvertently. Yes, did you have a question? So quizzical look.
So the person is karet offense
by accident.
By accident, without knowing it.
Right.
Without knowing it, he still has to bring up.
Well, the issue of how much he has to have known before is the debate. In other words, so in other words, Munbaz is saying if you never heard of Shabbat, true, it's a violation that requires a korban chatat, but you never knew about it, so you're exempt. Everyone else is saying you at least have to bring one for all the times you didn't keep Shabbat. That argument stands, but in other words, Munbaz was bringing the equation between the purposeful violator and the inadvertent to teach you that they both require some level of awareness to qualify. And then the rabbis are saying, no, we just take that equation to teach you what kinds of violations require a korban, not to teach you that the individual had to have had prior awareness to count as an inadvertent violator. That's a different issue. We disagree with you on that. We just use that equation to teach you what kind of violations. Okay, so that's what we're saying now.
In order to bring a chatat, so what they're saying is that in order to bring a chatat, you don't take into consideration the intent. Right? You're just...
the fact that you did it by accident. Well, the number of chataot you have to bring might depend on that. How many mistakes you made. But if you are, let's say, living in... your parents raised you in Timbuktu, you never heard of such a thing as Shabbat, and one day you come and you meet a Jew and he teaches you about Shabbat, and you're 50 years old, so 50 years you violated every Shabbat. So still... you only have to bring one, according to the Chachamim, and according to Munbaz, none, because you never knew about it before.
Okay.
Right? But how do we know that it's only... how do we know that for, let's say, not shaking lulav, I don't have to bring a korban chatat? How do we know that for eating bacon, I don't have to bring a korban chatat? The answer is because it's not something that you get karet. That's the answer, yeah. So ve'ella Munbaz... so let's go back to Munbaz for a second, because Munbaz is a little bit puzzling. Shigaga b'mai. What kind of shigaga do you have to have? In other words, since according to Munbaz, he said, Rabbi Akiva said, if you're going to really equate inadvertent to purposeful, so I'm going to tell you that just like a purposeful violator knows at the moment what he's doing, so too does the inadvertent violator have to know in the moment what he's doing. But wait a second. And Munbaz says, you're right. Chazaku Baruch, I agree with you. So wait a second. So then what's the difference between purposeful and inadvertent if you know what you're doing? So what's the answer? Kegon sheshagag bekorban. He says, you didn't know. Now this is fascinating. In other words, a person knew that you can't violate Shabbat. This is what Munbaz would say. He knew that you cannot cook on Shabbat. But he didn't know that if you cook on Shabbat by accident, you have to bring a korban. He just knew that you're not allowed to cook on Shabbat. That's enough to say that it was by accident. In other words, Munbaz says that what is the threshold for by accident? Any lack of knowledge of the parameters of the prohibition. In other words, even if you didn't know, you knew that it was a violation, and you even might have known that doing it on purpose would be a karet. You knew that. But you didn't realize that doing it inadvertently requires a person to bring a korban. That's also considered a lack of awareness. So everybody agrees if you didn't know, if you knew about Shabbat and you forgot about it, that you have to bring a korban khatat. Everybody agrees if you knew that a certain thing was prohibited and you forgot about it, that you have to bring a korban. But if you didn't, Munbaz is going even further. He's saying the threshold is so low for what's considered inadvertent that even if you didn't know one of the possible consequences, you knew everything but one thing. In other words, you're going and you're going to cook on Shabbat an egg, and you know that it's prohibited to cook an egg on Shabbat. And you even might know that the penalty for doing it on purpose is karet, and you're going to do it anyway, but you didn't know that accidental violators have to bring a korban khatat. That's downgraded to accidental, because you didn't completely know all the consequences of the violation.
Even though you're doing the violation
on purpose? Yeah, even though you know what you're doing.
So you didn't know the whole rule.
In other words, that's what Munbaz is saying, that what he agrees with Rabbi Akiva, that it's still considered shogeg unless you fully understand the consequences of the action. In other words, it's still considered a lack of I guess what Munbaz would say, it sounds a little bizarre, but I think what Munbaz would say is you don't fully understand the consequences of your action unless you know that even an accidental violator has to bring a korban. In other words, that's a measure of knowing the full. For example, let me give you an example. It's an amazing chidush.
When it comes to kiruv.
Yeah, so look at it this way.
People who are chozer b'tshuva.
Yeah, look at it this way. Let's say a person didn't bring a korban, like in the days of didn't do a brit milah. So it's also karet. It's also karet, but you don't bring a korban khatat because it's not a violation. In other words, it's a lack. There are two mitzvot two positive mitzvot that require that they give you karet if you don't do them. One we have today, which is brit milah. The other one is korban pesach, which we don't have today. We don't have a paschal offering today. But there you have karet without a korban. So there's a sense in which that seems like a lesser violation because a person who, let's say, accidentally didn't bring a korban pesach would not bring a korban to atone for that. So you would say, okay, so that's not as severe as somebody who, let's say, ate chametz on Pesach, because he would bring a korban chatan. So what Munbaz is saying is not that you're crazy and yes, we realize you just cooked the egg on Shabbat on purpose. But the fact of the matter is, you didn't realize how bad it was, because you didn't know that even an accidental violator, maybe if you had known that it's so severe that even an accidental violator has to bring a korban, this is how Tosafot explains it. Maybe if you had known that even an inadvertent violator has to bring a korban, you would have abstained from the transgression. Okay, that's the way that's why he's considering you to be still lacking awareness.
The fact is that there are two levels below this, right? The level right below this is knowing exactly the consequences and doing it, but feeling bad about it. In other words, not having the ability to do it like a smoker who knows exactly what happens and knows exactly that he's going to die of lung cancer, but still smokes.
Like mumar le'te'avon versus mumar la'hachis.
Right, because
we say mumar la'chis is different. Right, that's different category.
But then the level below this is like, no, I'm doing it and I don't care.
I'm against it, or I'm doing it,
because that's the right thing to do. Right. So he's
there are worse levels of mezid for sure.
But according to Munbaz, in this situation, a person cooks the egg on Shabbos, knows that he's making Shabbos, knows that it's kares if you do it on purpose, but doesn't know
that you have to bring a korban chatat.
He's not liable for a korban, but he still gets kares.
He would be liable for a korban according to Munbaz because what he did wasn't with full awareness. That's the chidush. She's saying, because you didn't know you'd be liable for a korban, you are liable for one. Because it's not, in other words, if you do something on purpose, you're not liable for a korban. Normally. But Munbaz is saying, you're still considered a not fully aware violator.
So it's not karet.
And you would, right, exactly. And you would, in other words, he's going to say you only get the karet if you knew the full extent of the consequence.
Otherwise you don't do any korban.
Then you would bring a korban because now you're b'shogeg.
But if not, he's saying.
If you knew everything and you did it, then you wouldn't bring a korban because that's totally b'mezid for sure. Yeah. Now, so now we go back for a second. V'Rabbanan shigaga V'Rabbanan shigigat korban lashma shigaga. According to the rabbis, not knowing that you have to bring a korban if you did it by accident is not called lack of awareness about the prohibition. If you knew the prohibition and you knew the consequence, for sure, that's on purpose. But now we're going to still have a machloket on this though, still. Because, v'Rabbanan shigaga b'mai, so where is the line drawn in the sand for the other rabbis? That's the question. And Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish are going to argue about that. Rabbi Yochanan amar kevan shishagag b'karet afal pi shehezid balav. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, if you didn't know that it was karet, even though you knew it was prohibited, that's b'shogeg. That's by accident. We can understand that. In other words, you didn't know, you did this on purpose, but you didn't know what the penalty was for doing it on purpose. That's different than munbaz. Munbaz would say you're doing it on purpose, but you didn't know what the penalty was for doing it by accident, so it's downgraded. Rabbi Yochanan is saying you did it on purpose, but you didn't realize how serious the penalty was for doing it on purpose. You didn't realize that it was karet. According to Reish Lakish, you had to have not known it was prohibited. Obviously, therefore, you also don't know what the penalty is. So in the moment that you did it, you can't say at the moment that I did it, I didn't realize that it was karet, but I knew it was prohibited. That's still on purpose. So you're going to be considered to be on purpose. But according to Reish Lakish, you had to have not known that it was prohibited at all for it to be considered really by accident. So that's the machloket here. Is it about consequence or about the prohibition? What's considered lack of awareness? So Amar Rava says, "My ta'amad Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish." What is the reason of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish? We can understand Rabbi Yochanan because Rabbi Yochanan is saying very simply, it's considered b'shogeg if you didn't know the consequences of your actions. So you didn't realize what the penalty was. So that makes sense. But what about Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish? Amar Kar, the pasuk says, "Asher lo te'asena ve'ashem." That it says that if a person violated something, asher lo te'asena, that he's not allowed to do, ve'ashem, and he's guilty. So this is talking about the parameters for bringing a korban chatat. It says that the person did something they're not supposed to do, and he becomes guilty. Ad shishgog belav v'charet sheba, because it says asher lo te'asena, that you violated something you're not supposed to do. Meaning that what were you unaware of? The fact that you're not supposed to do it. That's what he says. What is Rabbi Yochanan going to say about that pasuk? He's going to use it for a different reason. He's not going to say that pasuk teaches you that what you had to be unaware of was the fact that the thing was prohibited. Actually, even according to Rabbi Yochanan, even if you knew that it was prohibited, you could still be considered inadvertent if you didn't know the consequences. But what does he do with that pasuk? Because it says me'ama aretz, that if somebody from the people of the land committed a sin, prat mumar, this excludes a mumar. It excludes a person who is a mumar, means a person who's basically not religious. In other words, they don't accept the mitzvah at all, or they don't accept the mitzvot at all. So therefore, you can't really say to them, "Oh, you did that by accident." What do you mean by accident? I'm not religious. It wasn't by accident. Like a person goes and he drove on Shabbat. So now the person says, "Oh, I didn't realize it was Shabbat today. But even if I had, I would have driven anyway because I'm not Shomer Shabbat." So we're not going to say to the person, "Oh, you accidentally drove on Shabbat." He forgot it was Shabbat. That's true, but he didn't care because he wasn't religious. Okay, so that's prat lemumar mishum Rabbi Shimon. I'm sorry, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says in the name of Rabbi Shimon, Asher lo te'asena ve'ashem. What does it mean? Asher lo te'asena hashav midyato mevi korban al shekigato lo shav midyato eno mevi korban al shekigato. This is what Rabbi Yochanan is actually focusing on here. This principle that what is the definition of a person who did it b'shogeg? Hashav midyato. If a person would have known whatever information they're missing, they wouldn't have done it. That's the definition. In other words, what the definition of inadvertent is, had you known had you known X, you wouldn't have done it. So Rabbi Yochanan is saying, had you known it was karet, you wouldn't have done it. You knew it was prohibited, but you were prioritizing your observance. Had you known it was karet, you wouldn't have done it. That's the definition. So he would say, so that's the threshold. So it could be, in other words, it doesn't have to be that you didn't know the thing was prohibited, according to Rabbi Yochanan. It just has to be that you didn't know that the penalty was so severe. Okay, it would be like if a person is driving 100 miles an hour on the highway, and they say, even if you tell me, they don't realize how fast they're going, but even if they did, they would keep going anyway, because they're not looking at the speedometer. As opposed to somebody who says, I didn't realize that if you get caught for going that fast, you could be like, you're having license taken away. There's a difference. Maybe if he had known that, he knew it was illegal, but didn't know how bad it was, maybe he wouldn't have done it. So now, Tanan, we learned in the Mishnah, Avot Melachot, Arba'im Chaser Achat, this is actually the next Mishnah, that the Melachot of Shabbat, the primary Melachot, are 39, 40 minus 1. V'havenan, we asked the following question, why do we have to know the number? Can we not count? If you are reading the Mishnah, the presumption is you can probably count at least to 100, probably even more, probably even higher. So certainly we can count the 39 Melachot that are listed in the Mishnah, so why do we need to be told the number?
They don't ask that question anywhere else, like Arba Nezikim, Arba Amos Nezikim, or Arba
Right, that's true. Man, that's true. They don't ask it there.
Say the number, I can count to 4.
That's true. They don't say, but I believe there are other places where they do say minyana lamali for sure. Not that case, but yeah, there are others where they'll say it's lema'ute something, it's to exclude something. So here, it's not to exclude, but to teach us halacha. Rabbi Yochanan said, Shim asan kulan behelem echad, chayav al kol achat v'yachat. Rabbi Yochanan said that what it means is that if you did all 39 melachot, why does it have to tell you 39? To tell you that if you did all 39 melachot in one lapse of awareness, you would have to bring 39 chataot, 39 sacrifices for your 39 violations. Hechi mishkachat la, what are you talking about? What case could this possibly be? Bizdon Shabbat v'shegigat melachot. It would have to be that you knew it was Shabbat, but you made a mistake about melachot. Because remember, if you made a mistake and you didn't realize it was Shabbat, and you did 39 melachot on purpose, it's all one mistake. What was the one mistake? You didn't realize it was Shabbat. So the only time you bring multiple chataot is where you knew it was Shabbat, and your mistake was you didn't realize what you were doing was prohibited. Correct? So Bishlam al Rabbi Yochanan de Amar Kevan Shishagag Becharet Afal Pishezid Belav Mashkachat La Kigon Diadala Shabbat Belav. It makes sense according to Rabbi Yochanan that you could have a case where a person knew it was Shabbat and violated all of the 39 melachot because, why? He didn't realize how severe the penalty was. He knew that these were 39 things were prohibited on Shabbat. He didn't realize how seriously Shabbat is taken. He didn't know that it was bikaret. He didn't know what the penalty was. And he violated all 39 of them. It's possible. And then someone said, hey, you just violated all 39 melachot. Didn't you realize it's karet? And he said, oy vey, now I know. So it was all behelem echad. It was all in one lapse of awareness. Okay? Ela Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish damarat sheish gog belav uvcharet tiadali l'Shabbat b'mai. Wait a second, but according to Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, or also known as Reish Lakish, we have a problem because Reish Lakish said that the only time that you can be considered inadvertent is when you didn't know the thing was prohibited. In other words, and what is the case we're talking about here, where you knew it was Shabbat, but you didn't know that the 39 melachot, you would have to have forgotten that all 39 of the melachot were prohibited while remembering it was Shabbat. Now we have the question, what does it mean to remember it's Shabbat if you don't know any of the 39 melachot? In what way do you know it's Shabbat then? How does it make any sense? If you don't know anything that's prohibited on Shabbat, how is it that you know it's Shabbat? In what way? So the Gemara says, it must mean that you knew the prohibition of traveling outside the Tchum on Shabbat. This person, the only thing they knew about Shabbat is you're not allowed to walk outside the Tchum. You're not allowed to go outside of the border on Shabbat, which let's say is 2,000 amot outside of the city limits. You're not allowed to go. This is according to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva holds it's deoraita. Right? That's why it says, Va'ali b'd Rabbi Akiva. If it has to be according to Rabbi Akiva, that's the only way. There has to be some way in which he distinguishes Shabbat. Mantana lahaditanu Rabbanan. So who is the one who taught the following statement of the rabbi? Shagag bazeu bazeh. If you forgot that it was Shabbat and you forgot all the melachot, zeu shogeg ha'amur b'Torah. This is the very definition of bishogeg. You forgot completely. Hezid bazeu bazeh zohi mezid. He'amor b'Torah. If you forgot, if you knew it was Shabbat and you knew what you were doing was prohibited, that's the definition of b'mezid. That's the definition of doing it on purpose. Shagag b'Shabbat ve'ezid b'melachot. If the person forgot it was Shabbat, but he did the melacha on purpose, in other words, he went and he purposely cooked an egg, knowing that you can't cook an egg on Shabbat, but he thought it was Sunday morning. Okay, or sheshagag b'melachot ve'ezid b'Shabbat, or he knew it was Shabbat, but he forgot that you're not allowed to cook an egg, and he thought cooking was okay. Or she'amar yodeani she'melacha zo asura, or he said, I know this melacha is prohibited on Shabbat, aval eini yodeh shechayavin alei korban olo chayav. But he said to himself, I know you're not allowed to cook an egg on Shabbat, and I know it's Shabbat, but I didn't know that if you cook an egg on Shabbat by accident, you have to bring a korban. I didn't realize it's so serious that yes, I knew that I wasn't allowed to do this on Shabbat, and I knew that I knew that you get karet for doing it on purpose, but I didn't realize that it's so serious that you have to even bring a korban for doing it inadvertently. That's really uber serious. Okay, so that's what you said. So who's the one who says that that's still considered bishogeg? We know that already, right? Kiman kimunbaz. That's certainly representing the view of Munbaz. He's the only one that says that hypothetical lack of awareness that isn't even relevant to your case is still considered a lack of appreciation for the severity of that. I mean, that's the way you could put it, I guess. I guess you could divide it. You could say that basically the difference between the other rabbis and Munbaz is the other rabbis say that there's something about your violation right now that you don't realize. Either you don't realize it's prohibited, or you don't realize the consequence that you're going to get. Whereas Munbaz is saying, even if you didn't fully appreciate the severity of the violation, in theory, not just, it doesn't even apply to you, but you didn't know the gravity of it as a concept, that's also considered bishogeg. Interesting concept. Amar Rabbi Abai says, Akol modim bishvot bitui she'en chayvin alei korban shishgog belav Shabbat. Okay, he says that everybody agrees that when it comes to Shavuot B'Toy, a person made an oath that they're not going to eat cranberry muffins. I don't know why I thought of that, but I think I saw a cranberry muffin yesterday. Alright, so they made an oath they're not going to eat cranberry muffins, and then, according to Rashi, the case here is that they forgot about the oath. Okay, and they went and they ate the cranberry muffin. So everybody agrees that in the case of Shavuot B'Toy, there's a chidush that you bring it, even though it's not karet to violate a Shavuah. You made an oath not to eat the cranberry muffin. Eating the cranberry muffin is not karet, and yet it still requires you to bring a korban. So it's somewhat of a chidush, it's somewhat of a novelty. So there, everybody agrees that the definition of shogeg is that you didn't know what you were doing was wrong. In other words, you forgot that you made that oath. So
but it's not a korban chatat.
In other words, not knowing that you would have to bring a korban, in that case, it's a special kind of korban chatat called a korban olevi yored. But yeah,
right.
Yeah. So it's a special type. So everybody agrees that the person in this case would have to be unaware of what they're doing is wrong. Being unaware of the consequence wouldn't count. Okay? Why? So the Gemara says, Hakol modiman. Who do you mean everybody agrees? Who is the one we would expect to dissent here? Rabbi Yochanan, right? Because Rabbi Yochanan is the one who says that not knowing the consequence is enough to be considered bishogeg. Here we're saying everybody agrees in this case that not knowing the consequence is not enough. You have to have not known that what you're doing is wrong. So pshita, that should be obvious. Because when did Rabbi Yochanan say that not knowing the consequence defined you as bishogeg? That was where the consequence was karet. And he said, not knowing that this is karet, this makes you bishogeg. But in this situation, why would we assume that he would apply the same principle? In this situation, we should assume that since it's not a karet violation, he's of course going to tell you that you need to be unaware of what you're doing, that it's prohibited. Salka datach amina, you might have thought, ho'il v'chayav korban, it should say v'chiyuv korban chidushu. Since the chiyuv korban here, the obligation to bring a sacrifice is a chidush, it's a novelty. Because in the rest of the Torah, lo ashkachan lav demaiti alea korban. You don't find any prohibition that necessitates a korban. In other words, what it means by a lav is something that doesn't entail karet. Normally, only things that entail karet when they're done on purpose require a sacrifice when they're done by accident. And here you have a novelty. So we should say, and here you're bringing a korban. Ki shagag b'korban nami lechayev. In other words, in this case, Rabbi Yochanan should say that not knowing that you bring a sacrifice is a significant lack of awareness, because it's a major chidush. It's a major novelty. It speaks to the severity of the prohibition that it requires a korban when no other non-karet violation requires a korban.
Well, there's a parhid along the partial sibor, where the Beit Din Gadol posek something that's against halacha.
Right.
And what will sibor do it?
Right.
Then they have to bring a parhid along the part sibor or a seir if it's
if it's not right.
Yeah. So there is a problem because you do have a.
But that also is only when the Bet Din makes a psak, right? But there is though, because the halacha there is that the Bet Din has to make a psak about something which is zidono karet. It has to be. In other words, in the case of Horayot, the halacha is that if the Bet Din makes a mistake,
the people don't have karet. No karet.
They don't get karet, of course, but it has to be a violation which, if had they done it on purpose, would be karet. So it's the same category. Yeah, it's the same category of violations. Yeah. So even though it's not individual culpability, it's communal culpability. Now, so here we're talking about a novelty where you have a korban. So you might say that even Rabbi Yochanan is going to apply the same principle. Because what is his principle? If you didn't know that it was a karet-bearing violation, that means that you didn't really know what you were doing. So here also, it's an ordinary violation. There's no karet, but look, you have to bring a korban. That means that if you didn't know that you have to bring a korban for this, that means that you really didn't understand the seriousness of it. So kamash malan, we come along to say, as we turn to Amud Bet, that really, that even Rabbi Yochanan is going to say, the only time he holds that not knowing the consequence is equivalent to being bishogeg, is equivalent to being is an inadvertent violation, is where the consequence is karet. But not knowing that you have to bring a korban is not sufficient to be counted as inadvertent. So if you knew that you swore not to have cranberry muffin and you ate it, even though you didn't realize that eating that cranberry muffin was going to require you to bring a korban, that is not considered to be a lack of awareness of the severity of the prohibition, because it's not karet. So now the Gemara says, there is an objection, what is considered to be a violation bishkaga, an accidental violation of an oath, a Shavua Bitoy that was made in the past. In other words, what it means by in the past is you swore that you didn't have a cranberry muffin yesterday. Okay? So, She'im o Amar Yodea Ani Sheshvua Zo Asura Aval En Yodea Im Chayvin Alea Korban Olo Chayav. That if a person says, I know that I'm not allowed to say this oath, I'm about to swear because my Weight Watchers advisor is going to ask me if I had that cranberry muffin, and she's going to make me, or he is going to make me take an oath that I didn't have a cranberry muffin, so I need to take an oath. I know that I'm not allowed to take an oath, but I didn't realize, I don't know that making an oath by accident, or that violating an oath by accident requires a korban.
This is like just about making
so this
oath,
braita,
not about lying.
Yeah, well, it's about lying under oath.
Shvuat
bitoy l'shavar means you're swearing falsely about something in the past.
Falsely.
About something in the past. You did have the muffin. I ate the muffin, but I'm not going to tell my Weight Watchers advisor.
But there's no problem if he swears if indeed he did not have the muffin.
Well, it would be a problem if he had it.
No, but if he did
right, I mean, yeah. So
that's okay.
So what he's saying is, so if the person didn't realize when they made the false oath that oaths are so serious that when they are violated by accident they require a korban, that is considered to be a lack of appreciation for the severity of the violation. But the Gemara answers, Hamani Munbazi, that is clearly the opinion of Munbaz. Because Munbaz is the one that says that not knowing about something, which is only a hypothetical for you, but that reflects the seriousness of the violation, is also considered a lack of awareness, even if you do something on purpose. But everybody else holds that when it comes to making an oath, the person who knows that the oath they're taking or the oath they're violating is in force, and who realizes that it's a prohibition, is not considered to be doing it by accident, but is considered to be doing it on purpose. Now we have in parentheses here a piece of Gemara that Rashi actually erases from the Gemara, which is why it's in parentheses. But the other Rishonim, like Tosafot and others, salvage it. So we'll read it, but with the awareness that Rashi rejects this piece of the Gemara. Lishana Harina, another version. Mani, who is the author of this statement that says that if you didn't know that your oath, in other words, you're taking the oath on purpose, falsely, that you didn't have the cranberry muffin, but you didn't realize that oaths are serious enough to necessitate a korban when they're done by accident. So we said that's munbaz. Man ilem munbaz. If you're going to say that's munbaz, pshita, that's obvious. Ashta b'chol Torah, in the whole Torah, delav chidushu amar shigagat korban shema shigaga hachad chidushu lo kol sheken. So the way that the Gemara learns it this way is that munbaz, it's obvious that munbaz would consider a person who didn't know that oaths, when they're violated accidentally, require a korban. Certainly that person doesn't fully fathom the seriousness of what it means to violate an oath or to take an oath falsely. Because if he applies that rule to all other areas where it's not a novelty that a korban is brought, if he applies that principle to Shabbat, to all these other areas which are standard, that something which is a karet-bearing violation should necessitate a korban when done inadvertently, if even there he holds that not knowing the korban would be brought is a lack of appreciation for the severity, so certainly here where it is a chidush, where when it comes to oaths, it's a novelty.
I see what Rashi took it out.
Yeah, it's a novelty. So here it's a novelty, so not knowing it is actually a serious lack of awareness. In other words, because you wouldn't know it. You wouldn't assume it. So rather, it must be that the rabbis are the authors of this braita. And if the rabbis are the authors of this braita, then we reject Abaye and we say that actually no. It's not true that everybody agrees that being unaware that there is a special law that accidental violation of oaths requires a korban is a lack of awareness. Even the Chachamim agree with that. Because since it's a novelty here, that really is a lack of awareness. And Tosafot holds on to this piece of the Gemara and says it's correct. Rashi rejects this piece of Gemara because he says it wouldn't be obvious according to Munbaz anything. Okay? So that's a machloket rishonim whether we accept this piece of the Gemara or not. But the point is that they're trying to understand what kind of lack of awareness is really significant here, and the discussion goes on. Va'amar Abaye says, "Hakol modim b'truma she'en chayavin alei chomesh ad shishgog belav sheba." A similar case that a person eats teruma by accident. What's halacha? He's not a kohen, obviously. So what does he have to do? He has to compensate the kohen for the loss and also add a 1/5 penalty. So he says there, you only add if you purposely stole the teruma and you ate it, so you have to compensate the kohen, but you don't bring the extra 1/5 because the extra 1/5 is a kapara. It's an atonement. So when do you bring the chomesh? Only if you didn't know what you were doing wrong. In other words, you were unaware, for example, that what you were eating is teruma. But if you knew what you were doing was a violation, you just didn't know that you would have to bring a chomesh, or you didn't know some other penalty or consequence. You didn't know that it's mitab yedei shamayim to eat teruma. It's a serious consequence to do it on purpose, that there's death by the hands of heaven, that's pretty serious. That's not considered b'shogeg still. It's considered b'mezid. So hakol modim man. Who is the hakol modim? What do you mean everybody agrees that in the case of eating teruma, you have to have not known that eating teruma is prohibited? Or that this is teruma that you're eating. You had to have not known that what you're doing is forbidden for it to be considered bishogeg. Not knowing what the penalty is would not be enough. It's Rabbi Yochanan. But pshita, ki amar Rabbi Yochanan, echad ika karet, echad leka karet lo. Why would you think that Rabbi Yochanan, in other words, when it comes to violation of Shabbat, we understand Rabbi Yochanan says not knowing the penalty is equivalent to being unaware, because the penalty is karet. He never said that not knowing that you would have death by the hands of heaven, meaning physical death in this world, that would be that would also be a lack of awareness. So why should we assume that? Answer is, it is actually quite logical. Rabbi Yochanan would extend the principle. He would say, just like not knowing that karet is in place for a certain violation is considered a lack of awareness of the seriousness of the violation, so too, not realizing that by eating truma you're culpable for death at the hands of heaven, for mitah b'yedei shamayim, is a lack of awareness that's very significant. And he might equate the two. Kamash malan, we're coming along, Abaye is coming along to tell you that he doesn't equate the two. That karet is unique. Not knowing that a violation is a karet violation is considered a unique type of lack of awareness. But Rava says, Rava Amar Mita bimkom karet omedet v'chomesh bimkom korban ka'eh. I disagree, says Rava. And this is actually the halacha. Not knowing that eating terumah entails death by the hands of heaven is the same as not knowing that violation of Shabbat involves karet, involves spiritual excision or being cut off from the Jewish people. It is the same. And therefore, if you didn't know that penalty, you're still considered to be doing it inadvertently. Even though you knew that was terumah, the Kohen, your friend Mr. Cohen, just left the terumah on the table, and you knew it, and you ate it anyway. You knew that you're not allowed to because you're not a Kohen, but you didn't. And then somebody came and said, "Hey, you just ate that terumah. You think that's funny?" He said, "I know you're not supposed to," but he said, "Do you know that's mitah b'yedei shamayim? Very serious violation." I didn't know that. So that's considered bishogeg. So now the Gemara goes on to another case. Amar Rafuna hayam elech b'midbar. A person is walking in the desert. This is what Sammy mentioned yesterday. Ve'eno yodeh matay Shabbat. He loses track of the days. Imagine the movie. What was it called? The movie that where Tom Hanks is stranded on the island, right? He's there for days and years. He doesn't know what's going on, and neither does the person watching the movie. They're kind of hoping that the part will pass. It's a really long and dragged out. So drags on. So that movie is a good example. You lose track. He doesn't know what day it is anymore. He's not going to remember after a while. So Moneh. What does he do? So Shabbat. So Mishamer Yom Echad. The next day he should keep as Shabbat. And then l'shisha yamim. What he does is mishaber yom echad l'shisha yamim. He keeps. I'm sorry, I skipped the part. So it says moneh shisha yamim or mishaber yom echad. He counts 6 days and keeps the day of Shabbat. Chiyah barav omer mishaber yom echad u'moneh shisha. Chiyah barav says no. The next day you declare as Shabbat, and then you count 6 days after that. So the point here is you have to have a Shabbat, but you don't know what day it is. It could be Wednesday. So the halacha is either tomorrow call it Shabbat and then count 6 days and then have another Shabbat and then count 6 days and have another Shabbat, or count 6 days from the day that you realize that you lost count and then observe Shabbat after that. So one way or another you have to have a Shabbat.
So you're saying it's against the halacha if I walk across the date line.
Yeah, well, if you don't know.
And all of a sudden it's Motzi Shabbat.
Right, so, well, if you don't know, though, you'd be in trouble.
No, I know it's Mezid. I can.
Oh, you mean because you ended Shabbat prematurely?
I hear Erev Shabbat, I'll walk across it.
And you walk across it.
And it's...
Right. Yeah, I don't know about that, because in that case you have the issue of, you have to go kechumrei makom sheyatza misham. So it could be that you'd still have to finish Shabbat. You'd still have to finish the days of Shabbat. It's not so clear.
I think the Chazon Ish also said that you were supposed to hold 2 days of Shabbat.
In certain places. Yeah, it's true. New Zealand. That was a big deal, yeah. So, b'mai kami palgei, what is the argument here about how to do this? So, it's very interesting. Mar savar kabriyato shel olam. One says it should be like the creation of the world. Creation of the world is 6 days, then a Shabbat. So what should you do? You realize that you don't know what the count is. So the way to do it is, you count 6 days, and then you keep Shabbat. Because that's the way that the world worked. You counted 6 days, and then you declared Shabbat. Okay, so starting from the day that you realized you were off, and the other side says no. The other side says Umar Savar Ka Adam Arishon. The other one says it's like Adam Arishon. When was Adam Arishon created? On Friday. So in other words, they're basically saying, so Adam Arishon was created on Friday, so when you become aware, you say, okay, tomorrow's going to be Shabbat, just like Adam Arishon. But the idea is amazing, because really you don't know what day Shabbat is. You could be keeping Shabbat on Wednesday, you don't know. But the idea is that you have to have a structure of Shabbat that makes sense according to in other words, that individual, it's an unbelievable thing. You don't really know what Shabbat is, but you have to have a structure that reflects the concept of Shabbat in a meaningful way that connects back to the 6 days of creation and the 1 day of Shabbat, either based on the model of Adam HaRishon or based on the creation of the world. You are creating your own individual, personal Tom Hanks on the island Shabbat. Okay, that's what you're doing. What? Yeah, your own calendar. So then the Gemara says, where is an objection? If a person is walking on the way and he doesn't know what day Shabbat is, he should observe one day for every 6. Doesn't one day for every 6 mean that he waits 6 days starting from the day that he realizes that he's lost count? That's day 1, that's Sunday. And then at the end of the 6 days he has one day, he has Shabbat. Isn't that what it means? So that would seem to support that side of the argument. Lo, mishamer yom echad umone shisha. No, it means keep tomorrow as Shabbat and then count 6. But ihachi mishamer yom echad shisha. Then why does it say you should keep one day for every 6? Mishamer yom echad umone shisha mibailei. It should say keep one day and then count 6, not keep one day for every 6. Ve'od, and moreover, Tanya, we learned in another baraita, haya melech baderech o bamidbar. It says if you're walking on the way or you're in the desert, ve'eno yodea imatai Shabbat, you don't know what day is Shabbat. So what do? Moneh shisha umshamer yom echad. You count 6 and then you keep 1. So what does that show you? Tiyuvta, the Chiyah Barav Tiyuvta. That is a decisive refutation of Chiyah Barav, who said that you were supposed to first keep tomorrow as Shabbat and then count 6. No, it says you're supposed to count 6 starting from today and then keep Shabbat. Amar Rav Ravav says, B'chol Yom Vayom. So you have another problem though. Because yes, you invented your own structure of Shabbat, and it's amazing. We're going to see how far this goes actually. The halacha requires you to have a Shabbat individually, even though it's not the real Shabbat. But don't you have to reckon with the real Shabbat? So what do? Rava says, every day you have to do minimal amount of malacha, what you need to survive, except for that day. In other words, why? Because you have to survive. Pikuach nefesh. And any other day might be Shabbat. So the one day you set aside as Shabbat, Rava says you have to not do any malacha. The other 6 days, just do the minimum, because after all, any one of them might be actually Shabbat. You chose your Shabbat for yourself, but any one of those other days could be the real Shabbat. So you have to balance both. Ve'hau yoma lemut. Is he going to die on the day that he declared as his own Shabbat? It says you can't do kedei parnasato. You're in the middle of the desert. What are you going to do? You have to survive. Rather, de'avid me'etmol shetei parnasaot. You're going to tell me that he's going to be able to do double for the day that he needs to keep Shabbat. V'dilma me'etmol Shabbat avai. But maybe yesterday was Shabbat. In other words, maybe your Desert Friday is really Shabbat, and you're going to end up telling the guy, do double on that Friday because he's going to keep the next day as Shabbat. Really, that day he's considering Friday could be the real Shabbat. You just told him to do extra on the real Shabbat. It backfires. Rather, to be logically consistent, what do we have to do? To be logically consistent, we have to say, even the day that he is declaring a Shabbat, he has to do the minimal amount of melacha necessary to survive. What? Because it's a safek, it's very serious.
What about Yom Kippur? Any day may be Yom Kippur. If he waits the whole year.
That's true. At some point you're going to have that problem. Hopefully that won't.
All year.
Right. It's true. You have other issues. It's true. So once you tell me that every day he's anyway going to be observing Shabbat, or he's going to be mitigating, he's going to be limiting his melachot in order to allow for the possibility that it could be Shabbat. So if that's the case, how does that day that he declares as Shabbat make a difference then? He's not really resting on that Shabbat then completely. So what is the difference? The answer is B'kiddusha v'avdalta. He actually goes ahead and says Kiddush and Havdalah on that day. In other words, this guy could be doing it on Thursday. He doesn't really know. But he does Kiddush on Wednesday night and he does Havdalah on Thursday night. He doesn't know. So the halacha actually mandates for a person who's out of contact with civilization to create their own Shabbat, and then of course to account for the possibility that any other day might be Shabbat by minimizing melachot, but to actually declare one day Shabbat. It's a phenomenal idea. Now the Tosafot here says that walking, either we have to say that he's allowed to walk, otherwise he'll never get home. We can't say that he has to observe the Tuchum. Right? But otherwise, he has to minimize all other melachot, because to tell him to observe Tuchum is ridiculous. He's just going to die in the desert. That we're not going to do. Okay, so now we say, Amar Rava says, if he knows enough that he says, listen, I know I left 3 days ago. Okay? I know I left 3 days ago. I don't know what day it was, I can't remember anymore. But I know I left 3 days ago. So in that case, then osem lacha kol hayom kulo. That day that he knows he left, in other words, if he counts, okay, I know I left 3 days ago. Today's day 4. So on day 8, which would be the same as whatever day 1 was that I left, I know that wasn't Shabbat. There's no way I went out on Shabbat. And then day 15, I know that's not Shabbat. And then day 21, or 22 rather, I know that's not Shabbat. Right? Each week, I know that there's one day that's definitely not Shabbat. So, Pshita, this is obvious. Ma'ud detema, why do you have to tell me that? Isn't that obvious? So the answer is Kevan, the Shabbat lo napik b'ma'ale. Kevan, the Shabbat lo napik, since he won't go out on Shabbat. B'ma'ale Shabbata, nami lo napik. You might say that he could say, wait a second. I know I left 3 days ago. That's day 1. I know that couldn't have been Shabbat. But that means I know it also couldn't have been Friday. I also know it couldn't be Friday. So maybe I can allow for 2 days that I know for sure. I know it wasn't Friday and I know it wasn't Shabbat.
How does he know it's not Friday?
Because the assumption is he also wouldn't go out on a trip on Friday. Maybe you would think.
3 days, they say in the Shulchan 3 days before. So.
No, for sure. But he's saying that the Gemara is actually going to reject this. The Gemara is saying, Hava Amina, you might have thought that, I can assume that day was neither Friday nor Shabbat, which means I can say that I know day 1 wasn't Shabbat, and I know day 2 couldn't have been Shabbat because I wouldn't have left on Friday. The Gemara says no. V'hai inami b'chamisha b'shabbata napik, and the person would only really go out when? On Thursday, okay? So we should allow him to count day 1 and day 2, the day he left and the following day. For sure we're not Shabbat, because he wouldn't go out on Shabbat and he wouldn't go out on Friday. So at least 2 days couldn't have been Shabbat, right? The day that he left couldn't have been Friday and it couldn't have been Shabbat. And the second day couldn't have been Shabbat, because he wouldn't have left on Friday. So, but no, Kamash Malan, we say, Zimnin de mashkach she'erata umikri v'nafik. That there are some times where a person will go out on Friday on a trip. He might have gone on Friday, so we can't be sure that day 1 wasn't Friday. We can only be sure that day 1, because sometimes a caravan will come. It's an opportunity to travel that he's going to miss, and he has to go. So he did travel on Friday, but he would never do that on Shabbat. So the only thing we know is days 1, 8, 15, and 22, and 29, etc. are all days that were not Shabbat. That's the only thing we know. The Gemara says, we go down back to the Mishnah, that there are 2 ways a person can become. Sometimes a person is chayav, is liable for only 1 chatat, and sometimes multiple chataot. So how does this work? Where do we get this from? Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabba Baravua. Rav Nachman said that Rabba Baravua said, there are 2 pesukim. Shabbat. We say that the Jewish people kept the Shabbat. Uchtiv, and it says, Shabbatotai tishmoru. My Shabbatot you should keep. Eta Shabbat is singular. Shabbatotai is my Sabbaths in the plural. So haketzad, how does it work? V'shamru v'nei salata Shabbat shemira achat Shabbatot arbe. V'shamru says 1 Shabbat. Eta Shabbat. That means you can have 1 chatat for many Shabbatot. 1 shemira for many Shabbatot. That means the basic idea of Shabbat. Being aware of the basic idea of Shabbat is 1 level. You can violate many Shabbatot, and it's all one thing. You weren't aware of the concept of Shabbat. V'yat Shabbatotai tishmoru, but my Sabbaths you should keep. Shemira, that is a different thing. That's Shemira. That's Shemira achat lechol Shabbat v'Shabbat. That is a different observance for each Shabbat, because it's in the plural. Shabbatotai. So sometimes we look at it on one hand. In other words, this concept that forgetting the concept of Shabbat and violating many Shabbatot is only 1 korban. That comes from the pasuk V'shamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat, the singular. And the idea that violating many Shabbatot because you forgot what day it is, you would bring multiple korbanot. That comes from V'et Shabbatotai tishmoru, the plural. So 2 individuals can have violated the same number of Shabbatot. One did it because he forgot the whole concept of Shabbat. The other one did it because he kept forgetting what day it was. One will be liable for every single Shabbat, and one is liable for only one. Matkifla Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak argued with this derivation and proposed the opposite. Adraba, opposite. Ipcha mistabra. Makes more sense to go the opposite way. V'shamru v'nei Yisrael Shabbat shmira achat l'chol Shabbat v'Shabbat. That saying that the Jewish people kept the Shabbat means one observance, shemira achat lechol Shabbat b'Shabbat, for each and every Shabbat. V'yet shabbatotai tishmoru, my Sabbaths you shall keep, is shemira achat l'Shabbatot harbeh. It uses the plural to tell you one observance for many Shabbatot. In other words, it's a matter of how you look at the Pesukim. They agree on the concept. The point is, in one case the word Shabbat is in the plural, in one case it's in the singular. One of them is referring to the idea that there's really one observance that applies over many Shabbatot, and one pasuk is being used to say that each Shabbat is its own observance of Shabbat. Which pasuk applies to which is a matter of disagreement here, but the bottom line is that we have a precedent for looking at one hand at observance of Shabbat as a concept, like when we say someone is Shomer Shabbat. When I say you're Shomer Shabbat, I don't mean this past Shabbat you didn't work. I mean you are Shomer Shabbat as the concept, as opposed to somebody who's in process of becoming observant and says, I kept this Shabbat. That individual Shabbat was observed. So each and every Shabbat is its own entity, and there's a concept of a commitment to Shabbat as a concept. One person forgets the concept of Shabbat, they're disconnected from Shabbat. So we don't look at the individual Shabbatot that they desecrated, we look at the concept. Whereas the other, each Shabbat he keeps forgetting and thinking it's Sunday. So that person made a mistake with regard to the individual Shabbat that wasn't observed, not because he severed his connection to the concept of Shabbat as a monolithic entity. And this idea, this duality, is reflected in these two Pesukim. Have a great day.